This happened back in the late 90s, when I was in my early 20s, fresh out of college and living with my husband, Mark, in a small, rented house on the outskirts of town. It was one of those old, two-story places with a sloping roof and a big yard that always seemed to be fighting with the forest line behind it. Mark was a carpenter, and I was just starting out as a freelance graphic designer, so our lives were pretty quiet, centered around our work and each other. We were simple people, the kind who found joy in a good book, a shared cup of coffee on the porch, and the rhythm of a predictable routine. Nothing ever really happened to us. Our lives were like a calm lake, still, clear, and uneventful. But that day, that storm, it was like someone threw a stone right into the middle of it, and the ripples, well, they never really stopped. It started with a whisper of wind and ended with something that felt like a scream. The storm that afternoon was something else. It wasn't just rain, it was a deluge. The kind of downpour that makes the world go quiet, everything muffled except for the roar of the wind and the constant hammering of rain on the roof. We had the lights off, just sitting in the living room, listening to the thunder rumble in the distance, a low growl that shook the very foundations of the house. We were just enjoying the moment, wrapped in a blanket, when we first heard it. A faint tap-tap-tapping. It was rhythmic, and at first, we both just ignored it, convinced it was just a loose branch hitting the back door. But as the minutes passed, the sound persisted, a soft, insistent rhythm that was too steady to be the wind. It was a gentle, almost timid sound, like someone was trying not to be heard, but they were desperate to get our attention. Mark looked at me, his brows furrowed in a question I couldn't answer. Who would be at our back door in this kind of weather? And why were they knocking so quietly? I remember Mark getting up, a little annoyed, muttering something about a kid playing a prank. He walked to the back door, and I followed him, my heart doing a little flutter kick of its own. When he opened the door, a gust of wind and rain rushed in, but there was no one there. The porch was empty. He was about to close the door, a frustrated sigh on his lips, when I saw it. Lying right in the middle of the porch, drenched and strangely pristine, was a small, bright red toy car. It was the kind you'd see a toddler playing with, a chunky, plastic thing with big, mismatched wheels. The most unsettling part? Despite the lack of wind on the ground, the wheels were slowly, deliberately spinning on their own, a silent, almost hypnotic revolution. It was such a small thing, so mundane and out of place, but it felt like the most terrifying thing in the world at that moment that we stood there for a few seconds, just staring at the car, trying to process what we were seeing. Then Mark knelt down, his eyes scanning the wet wooden planks of the porch. That's when he saw the footprints. Tiny, bare footprints leading from the edge of the yard, across the grass, and right up to the porch. They were so small, the size of a child's foot, and they were perfectly formed in the mud. But the strangest, most bone-chilling detail was that they just stopped. They came to an abrupt end just a few feet from the car, as if the person who made them had simply vanished into thin air. We looked around, scanning the yard, the trees, the dense fog that was settling in, but there was no one. The only thing left was that little red car, its wheels still turning, a silent, eerie invitation to a mystery we didn't want to solve. We just wanted to close the door and pretend none of this had ever happened. I think that's when the real fear set in. It wasn't the storm or the strange footprints. It was the chilling silence that followed. Mark finally picked up the car, his hand shaking slightly as he held the strange, cold plastic. The wheels stopped spinning the moment his fingers touched it. He just stood there for a second, lost in thought, before he slowly closed the door, the click of the lock echoing in the quiet house. We both just stared at each other, the same unspoken question in our eyes. What was that? We walked back to the living room in a daze, the little red car clutched in Mark's hand. He placed it on the coffee table, a grotesque centerpiece to our normal, cozy afternoon. We couldn't bring ourselves to talk about it, couldn't bring ourselves to look at it for more than a second. We just sat there, a silent, heavy weight of dread settling between us, and that's when it happened. A sound so familiar, so completely out of place, that it made my blood run cold. Tap, tap, tappity-tap. The same rhythmic knocking, but it wasn't coming from the back door. It was coming from the hallway, just a few feet from where we were sitting. It was a clear, crisp sound, as if tiny knuckles were rapping on the wall itself. Mark's head whipped around, his eyes wide with a fear I'd never seen before. I didn't even have to look at him to know he was feeling the same thing. The knocks moved. They started near the kitchen, then traveled down the hallway, getting closer and closer to us. It was like whatever was outside was now inside, and it was moving with a terrifying purpose, a playful but sinister game of hide and seek. We just sat there, frozen, listening to the knocks get louder, closer, until they were right outside the living room door. And then there was a final, single tap on the door frame, as if to say, "I'm here." And then, just like that, the knocking stopped. A profound silence fell over the house, broken only by the relentless drumming of the rain outside. It was a silence so heavy, it felt like an entity in itself, pressing down on us, stealing the air from our lungs. I was holding my breath, my entire body rigid with fear, my eyes locked on the door frame. I could see Mark's knuckles turning white as he gripped the armrest of the chair. We sat there in the dark for what felt like an eternity, waiting, listening for the slightest sound. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The fear had paralyzed me, rooted me to that spot. It was as if some unseen presence was standing just on the other side of that door, holding its breath with us, enjoying the terror it had inflicted. Slowly, deliberately, Mark rose from the chair. His movements were stiff, unnatural, like a puppet on strings. "I'm going to check," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. I shook my head violently, trying to silently plead with him not to go, but he didn't even look at me. He was in some kind of trance, a grim determination etched on his face. As he walked towards the living room door, I felt an almost magnetic pull, a sickening premonition that something terrible was about to happen. Every footstep he took echoed in the silence, each one a hammer blow to my already frayed nerves. He reached the door, his hand hovering over the handle, and I braced myself for whatever horror awaited him on the other side. He slowly turned the knob, a soft metallic creak cutting through the oppressive silence. He pulled the door open, a sliver of darkness widening into a view of the empty hallway. There was nothing there, just the dark wood floors, the faint outline of our wedding photos on the wall, and the heavy, humid air of the storm. He let out a long, shaky breath, and I could feel the tension drain from his shoulders. Relief, a sweet, fragile thing, washed over me. For a moment, it felt like we had imagined the whole thing. The toy car, the footprints, the knocking, all of it was just a product of our overwrought imaginations, fueled by the storm and the dark. But then, Mark's gaze dropped to the floor, and I saw his body stiffen again. He wasn't looking at the floorboards themselves, but at the little gap beneath the door to the guest bedroom. A tiny, pulsating red light was shining through the crack. It was the same vivid red as the toy car. He took a cautious step forward, his hand still on the living room door, and I heard it, the faint, whirring sound of a toy car's motor. It was coming from inside the room, a soft, continuous hum, as if the little car was driving around in circles on the floor, waiting for us. The fear came back with a vengeance, colder and sharper than before. It wasn't just a simple haunting, it was a game, and we were the unwilling players that we didn't need to open the door to know what was inside. We just stood there, staring at the little red glow, listening to the soft whirring that was so out of place, so wrong, in our silent house. Mark's shoulders slumped, and a look of pure, utter defeat came over his face. He didn't try to open the door. He didn't have to. The little toy car had shown us what it wanted us to see. It had found its way inside, and it was waiting. We just backed away slowly, like two people retreating from a wild animal, and went back into the living room. We sat in silence, the little red car on the coffee table a constant, unsettling reminder of what was on the other side of that door. We didn't talk, we didn't move. We just listened to the storm rage outside and the silence inside, a silence now punctuated by the soft whirring from the guest room as the night wore on. The sound from the guest room never stopped. It was a constant, low hum, like a heartbeat, and with every passing minute, it felt like it was getting louder, closer. We tried to sleep, but we couldn't. We just lay in bed, side by side, our hands clasped together, listening to that sound. It was a long, terrifying night, and by the time the sun came up, the storm had passed, but the fear hadn't. We got up, exhausted and hollow, and walked towards the guest room. The whirring had stopped. We opened the door slowly, our eyes scanning the room. There was nothing there. The room was just as it had always been, empty, dusty, and silent. There was no little red car, no light, no footprints on the carpet. Nothing. We checked the rest of the house, the back porch, the yard. The toy car was gone. The footprints were gone. It was as if it had never happened. To this day, we never speak of it. It's a memory we both share, a wound that never fully healed. A single, bizarre day that completely shattered the peace of our simple lives. It came with the storm and left with the sun, but it left behind a quiet, persistent fear that still lives in the dark corners of our house. We learned that some things don't need a logical explanation, and some mysteries are better left unsolved. We're still living in that same house, but we've learned to live with the silence, and we've learned to listen for the whispers of a storm that could bring the knocking back at any time. This happened back in '09. I was living in a small, kinda isolated house about half an hour outside of town. It was just me and my dog, a scruffy mutt named Rusty, who was more of a sleepy carpet than a guard dog. I just turned 25 and was working a mindless desk job that paid the bills but left me feeling like a zombie most of the time. My routine was pretty much the same. Wake up, go to work, come home, have a beer, watch some TV, and crash. The house was a bit old, a two-story with creaky floorboards and a draft that always seemed to find its way in, no matter how many times I sealed the windows. The nearest neighbor was a good half-mile away, so it was always quiet. Dead silent, actually. And that night, it was even quieter than usual, the kind of stillness that just hangs in the air, heavy and thick that it must have been around 2 a.m. when I was jolted awake by a sound that didn't belong. It was a rapid, insistent knocking on my front door. Not a polite rap, but a series of hard, aggressive thumps, like someone was trying to break the wood. I sat up in bed, my heart instantly pounding in my chest, and looked over at Rusty. He didn't even stir. He was curled up on his dog bed, a little ball of fur and snores. That was the first thing that really got to me. Rusty usually barked at anything. A squirrel, a leaf, the wind, but he was completely motionless. The knocking came again, and with it, a deep, muffled male voice from the other side of the door. It wasn't loud, but it was clear enough to make out the words, "Is it open? Is it open?" It was repeated over and over, like a broken record, without any change in tone or pause. Just that flat, emotionless drone that I finally managed to kick off the blanket and get out of bed, my bare feet hitting the cold wooden floor. The silence in my room, contrasted with the relentless, pounding rhythm from downstairs, was deafening. I felt like I was moving through thick water, my body heavy and sluggish. I moved down the hallway, the old floorboards groaning under my weight, each creak sounding like a scream in the oppressive quiet. The knocking wasn't stopping, and the voice was still going. "Is it open? Is it open?" The words were so flat, so devoid of any emotion, that they were even more terrifying than if they'd been screamed. It was the most unnatural thing I'd ever heard, like a malfunctioning machine repeating the same phrase over and over. I finally reached the front door, my hand hovering over the peephole. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. I had this insane urge to just turn around and go back to bed, to pretend I never heard it, but a horrifying need to know what was on the other side kept me frozen in place. That I leaned in and pressed my eye to the peephole, a tiny glass portal to the outside world. All I saw was a deep, impenetrable black. The streetlights were out, which was already strange, but there was no one standing there. No figure, no silhouette, just a void. I pulled my head back from the door, a wave of cold panic washing over me. The knocking stopped. Just like that, it was gone. But the voice wasn't. It was still there, saying, "Is it open? Is it open?" And that's when it hit me. The sound was no longer coming from outside. It wasn't muffled by the door anymore. It was clear as day, and it sounded closer. I froze, my blood turning to ice. I felt a sharp, gut-wrenching certainty that the sound wasn't coming from the entrance anymore. It was coming from the back of the house, from the dark, narrow hallway that led to the kitchen. My whole body went rigid as I realized the voice had somehow, impossibly, made its way inside. That my breath hitched in my throat, a cold, sharp pain. My entire body went rigid as a board. I was paralyzed by a terror so profound it felt like a physical weight pressing down on me, gluing my feet to the floor. The voice was now coming from the hallway behind me, the one leading to the kitchen. It was the same monotonous, emotionless male voice, but now it was clearer, less muffled, as if the door had never even been there. Is it open? Is it open? It droned, just a few feet away. My mind raced, frantically trying to find a logical explanation. I ran through every possible scenario: a prank, a burglar, a sound coming from my neighbor's house. But none of it fit. My neighbors were a half-mile away, and the house was locked tight. The silence from Rusty was the most unnerving part. He was still sleeping soundly upstairs, oblivious to the horror unfolding just below him. I needed to see him, to feel his presence, to have some proof that my world hadn't completely shattered. But the voice was between me and the stairs that I had to make a choice, and the only choice I could think of was to move. I took a step back, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it would burst. The floorboard under my foot creaked loudly, and I froze, my eyes wide in the pitch black. The voice stopped for a fraction of a second, and in that agonizing pause, I felt a new kind of terror. It was listening. Then it started again. Is it open? Is it open? But now, it sounded like it was coming from the kitchen itself, just beyond the archway. The air in the house felt heavy, thick with something malevolent and unseen. I could almost feel a presence in the darkness, a cold spot in the air that wasn't there before. I squinted into the dark hallway, but the shadows were a solid wall. I couldn't see a thing, but I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that whatever was speaking was now standing in my kitchen. It was taunting me, waiting. I felt a primal fear, the kind that makes the hair on your arms stand straight up, that I stood there, frozen, staring into the blackness of my own kitchen. The voice continued its rhythmic mantra from somewhere within the dark space. Is it open? Is it open? It whispered, the sound now so close it felt like it was inside my head, a parasitic thought. I could make out the faint outlines of the cabinets and the refrigerator, but everything was swallowed by the darkness. The familiarity of the room was gone, replaced by an unnerving and hostile presence. The dread in my stomach turned into a sick, churning feeling. My fight-or-flight response was screaming at me to run, but where? The front door felt miles away, and the stairs to Rusty were blocked. My mind, still grappling with the sheer impossibility of the situation, was a total mess. Why would it be asking that? What was it asking to be open? My hand instinctively went to my pocket, fumbling for my phone. The screen light felt like a beacon in the suffocating dark. As I pulled it out, the voice stopped. The sudden silence was a punch to the gut, even more terrifying than the sound. My heart hammered against my ribs, echoing in the quiet. I held my breath, waiting for something, anything. Then, a new sound cut through the silence. A soft, wet shuffling from the kitchen floor. It was a sound that shouldn't have been there, a sound that made my skin crawl. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct, like something was dragging itself across the linoleum. The dread I felt before was nothing compared to this. It was a tangible, physical sound, confirming that whatever was in there wasn't just a voice. It was moving. The shuffling stopped and the voice started again. Is it open? Is it open? But this time, it was right by the kitchen archway, and the voice was followed by a chilling, ragged gasp that I didn't even scream. A sound was trapped in my throat, a choked sob of pure terror. I spun around, my phone and its single beam of light shaking wildly. The hallway behind me was empty. The door was still closed, the stairs still leading to a soundly sleeping Rusty. Nothing was there, but the cold dread, the feeling of something having been right there, was overwhelming. My breath was coming in ragged gasps, and I could feel the cold sweat on my back turn into a chill. I ran, not toward the front door, but up the stairs, my feet hitting each creaky step in a frantic rhythm. I didn't care about the noise anymore. I just needed to get to Rusty, to feel a warm, living thing. I burst into my bedroom, the light from the hallway spilling in, and there he was, curled up in his bed, still a little furry ball of snores. He hadn't moved, not an inch. The horror of that made my knees buckle. He heard nothing. It was all for me that I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat on my bed, with Rusty in my lap, the phone clutched in my hand, staring at the closed door. The sun finally came up, and the first rays of light cutting through the window felt like a blessing from God himself. The house was normal again. The creaks were just old house noises. The silence was just peaceful quiet. I called a locksmith that morning and had a new lock installed, a heavy-duty deadbolt, even though I knew, deep down, that it wouldn't have made a difference. I moved out a month later. I never told anyone the full story, not even my family. Not until now. I still don't know what it was. A demon? A ghost? A figment of my sleep-deprived imagination? But I know what it meant when it whispered, "Is it open?" It wasn't about the front door. It was about my defenses, my sense of security, my mind. It was asking for permission, waiting for me to open something far more important than a door. I've never felt truly safe since that night, and every time I'm home alone and hear a knock, even a normal one, I freeze. I guess I'm just here to ask if anyone else has ever heard that voice. It's still so vivid in my head, even after all these years. It happened back in the fall of 2012, my first semester at State University. I was a freshman, and the world was my oyster. I had this tiny little dorm room on the 5th floor of Miller Hall, which was one of those old, brick buildings with ivy crawling up the walls. My room was a single, and I chose it specifically so I could have my peace and quiet to study, but mostly so I could be left alone with my books and music. Life was simple then. My biggest worry was whether I'd ace my calculus final or if I had enough ramen noodles to last me through the week. The room itself was pretty standard: a twin bed, a desk crammed into a corner, and a window that looked out over the campus quad. That window was my favorite part of the room. It was a perfect rectangle of glass that framed the big oak trees and the walking paths below, and at night, with the campus lights twinkling, it was like looking at a postcard. I remember that night. The rain was coming down in sheets, a real classic fall thunderstorm. The kind that makes you want to curl up under a blanket and just listen to the rhythm of the drops hitting the glass. I was in bed, buried under my comforter, trying to read a textbook, but mostly just enjoying the sound. That's when I heard it. A soft, rhythmic sound that was different from the rain. It wasn't the steady drumming of water, but something else. It was a tap, tap, tap sound. At first, I thought maybe it was a branch from one of the old trees, tapping against the window in the wind. But the sound was too deliberate, too evenly spaced. And the wind wasn't that strong. It wasn't swaying the branches violently enough to make that kind of a sound. My heart started to beat a little faster, a low thrum against my ribs. I pulled my comforter up to my chin, my eyes fixed on the window. The sound continued, persistent and methodical. Tap, tap, tap. A shiver ran down my spine. We were on the 5th floor. There was no balcony, no fire escape, nothing. The wall was a smooth, brick expanse all the way down to the ground. There was no way anyone could be up there. It was impossible, but the sound was real. It wasn't my imagination. My mind raced, trying to find a rational explanation. Maybe it was something loose on the roof, but the sound was coming from the window, right in front of me. I held my breath, listening. The rain a distant, muted roar in the background. The tapping stopped for a moment, and I let out a shaky sigh, thinking it was over. But then it started again, this time a little louder, a little more insistent. Tap, tap, tap. It was definitely coming from the glass itself. I swear my blood turned to ice. It wasn't just the knocking. It was the absolute, total silence that followed each set of taps. The rain would keep drumming on the roof, the wind would howl, but right after those 3 distinct knocks, it was like the world outside my window just went dead. All I could hear was the frantic, panicked thumping of my own heart in my ears. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body was frozen in place. My breath hitched in my throat. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the window, even though every instinct screamed at me to pull the covers over my head and pretend I didn't exist. The glass was so foggy from the rain and the temperature difference that all I could really see was a blur of darkness. But I knew, with a certainty that made me want to throw up, that something was on the other side. Something or someone. The logical part of my brain kept trying to rationalize it. Maybe a prank, a drone, some sick joke. But the primal fear in my gut knew better. This was wrong. So wrong that I had to see. I don't know why, but I felt this overwhelming, morbid curiosity. My legs moved on their own, a slow, agonizing creep across the cold wooden floor. Every step was like a drumbeat, echoing in the quiet room. I got to the window, and my hand trembled as I reached out to wipe a clear spot on the glass. The condensation felt slick and cold under my palm, and that's when I saw it. A dark, indistinct shape pressed against the pane. It wasn't a face, not really. It was more like a smudge of shadow, a silhouette of a person, but with its face, or where its face should have been, flattened right against the glass. The proportions were all off. The shoulders were too broad, the head too small, and the way it was just hovering there. It didn't make sense. And then, the silhouette's lips started to move. I couldn't hear anything over the sound of my own ragged breathing, but I could see them, clear as day, mouthing something in the dark. My mind screamed at me to run, to scream, to do anything, but I was rooted to the spot, watching that impossible shape whisper to me through the glass. And then, a brilliant, white flash of lightning ripped through the sky, illuminating the entire room and the world outside the window. For a fraction of a second, everything was starkly, terrifyingly clear. There was no silhouette, no face pressed against the glass. The window was empty, just the distorted rain and the dark campus beyond. The flash was gone as quickly as it came, and the world plunged back into a suffocating darkness, with only the distant streetlights to offer a weak, hazy glow. The tapping was gone, too. The whispering, all of it. The only sound was the frantic drumming of the rain and the even more frantic pounding of my heart. I stood there, panting, my hands still pressed against the cold glass, a perfect, hand-shaped print in the condensation. Did I imagine it? Was it just a trick of the light, a figment of my terrified imagination? I tried to tell myself that, to make myself believe it. That I stumbled back from the window, my knees weak, and collapsed onto my bed, pulling the comforter over my head. I wanted to disappear. I wanted to wake up and realize it was all a nightmare. But my hand, the one that had been on the glass, felt like it was burning, and my skin was slick with sweat. I lay there for what felt like hours, listening to the storm, too terrified to move, too afraid to even look at the window again. Sleep was impossible. My mind kept replaying that fraction of a second when the lightning lit up the room. The emptiness. The total, absolute emptiness. It was the scariest part of all. The idea that something could be there one moment, close enough to whisper to me, and then just not be there. No explanation, no logical reason, nothing. It felt like a violation, like something had looked at me, acknowledged me, and then just vanished into thin air. I stayed awake all night, staring at the ceiling, waiting for another sound that never came. The next morning, the sun was out, and the world seemed to have returned to normal. The campus quad was a shimmering green, with puddles reflecting the bright blue sky. But my sense of normal was shattered. I felt like I was moving through a dream. The room, which I had loved, now felt alien and hostile. I couldn't look at the window without my stomach clenching. It was just a regular window, a simple pane of glass. But to me, it was a portal to something I couldn't understand. I went to class, but I couldn't focus. All I could see in my mind's eye was that dark silhouette, its lips moving, and that flash of lightning that revealed nothing. It was like I was holding a secret, a heavy, cold secret that I couldn't tell anyone. Who would believe me? Hey, a ghost knocked on my fifth-floor window and whispered to me. They'd think I was crazy or just looking for attention. So, I kept it to myself, but the silence felt like a scream. The fear from the night before was a living thing inside me, a constant, low-level dread. That afternoon, after my classes, I decided I had to do something. I couldn't just sit in my room and wait for something else to happen. I needed to see for myself. I went down to the first floor and walked outside, to the side of the building where my room was. I wanted to see the wall, to see if there was any way, any crack or ledge that could have supported a person. I stood there, craning my neck, staring up at the 5 stories of solid, uninterrupted brick. There was nothing. Not a single ledge, not a loose brick, not even a drain pipe. The wall was smooth and uniform, from the ground all the way up to my window. The more I looked, the more the cold knot in my stomach twisted. The only thing I saw was a small, perfectly round, metal plate embedded in the brickwork about waist height, with what looked like an old, faded university seal on it. It was completely out of place and weirdly ominous. It just solidified what I already knew. What happened last night was impossible. It wasn't a prank. It wasn't a person. It was something else. And the thought of that something else was 1,000 times more terrifying. After my little investigation of the building's exterior, I felt this weird mix of validation and pure terror. The impossible was now just impossible, with no other options left. The logical side of my brain was screaming, and the emotional side was completely numb. I had to get back to my room, But the thought of opening that door and seeing that window again made me want to bolt in the opposite direction. I eventually forced myself to go back, telling myself I was being ridiculous, that the sun was shining and everything was fine. But as soon as I stepped inside my room, a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning washed over me. I stood in the middle of the room, looking around. The bed was unmade, my textbook was still open on the floor, and the window was still a simple pane of glass. But it wasn't simple to me anymore. It was a scar. It felt like something had been ripped open, and now I could see a part of the world that I wasn't supposed to. I tried to get on with my day. I did laundry, I worked on a paper, and I even Skyped my mom, trying to sound as normal as possible. But the whole time, my eyes kept flicking to the window. Every time a car horn beeped or a person laughed outside, I flinched. The world felt too loud, too close. I was trapped in my own head, reliving that impossible moment over and over again. As the sun began to set, a different kind of dread started to creep in. A cold, quiet dread. The kind that makes the hairs on your arms stand up. I didn't want to be in that room when the sun went down. I didn't want to be in the dark, alone with that window again. I considered calling a friend, asking to crash on their couch. But how could I explain? Hey, can I stay with you because a phantom tapped on my 5th floor window last night? It sounded insane. So I stayed, but I pulled my desk chair right in front of the door and didn't even bother to close the curtains. I just sat there, under my desk lamp, facing the door, with my back to the window, waiting for the night to fall. As I sat there, hunched over my desk, I kept glancing at the clock. Every minute felt like an hour. My paranoia was at an all-time high. I jumped at every creak of the old building, every footstep in the hallway, every gust of wind against the glass. I kept telling myself it was just a storm, a random event, but the memory of those tapping fingers and the whispering lips was an unshakable truth in my mind. The campus lights outside my window started to turn on, one by one, painting the world outside in a sickly yellow-orange glow. It felt like the world was holding its breath. The rain had stopped, and the air was still and heavy. The silence was the worst part. It felt like a stage was being set for the next act of the horror movie I was living. I finally gave up on pretending I could do anything productive. I turned off the desk lamp and sat in the dark, the faint glow from the campus lights filtering into my room, painting everything in shades of gray. I hugged my knees to my chest, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs, and just waited. I felt like a mouse in a cage, waiting for the cat to come back and play. Around midnight, a strange, low-frequency hum started. It wasn't loud, just a subtle vibration that I could feel in my bones, like a distant engine running. It seemed to be coming from outside, from the direction of my window. My blood ran cold. I pressed my back against the wall, trying to make myself as small as possible. The hum grew, a low, guttural thrum that vibrated through the floor and up my spine. It was a sound that didn't belong in the natural world. It sounded mechanical, but also deeply organic and wrong. And then, the humming stopped, and the silence was even more profound than before. My eyes, now adjusted to the dark, were fixed on the window. The reflection of the room was hazy, but I could make out the distorted silhouette of my own terrified face. And just behind me, in the reflection, something shifted. A blur of movement, too fast to be real, passed by the glass. My blood turned to ice. I wasn't just imagining things anymore. Something was there, right outside my window. The air in the room grew heavy and cold, and the smell of ozone, like a storm after a lightning strike, filled the space. The tapping didn't come. There was no whispering, just the absolute, terrifying knowledge that I was not alone. Then, in a slow, deliberate movement, I saw it. A hand, a pale, long-fingered hand, slowly rising into view outside the window. It wasn't flat against the glass this time. It was a cupped, slightly clawed hand, as if it was reaching out to me, or perhaps gripping onto the brickwork. But there was nothing there to grip. The palm was facing inward, and the fingers were slightly bent. It was a shockingly normal-looking hand, almost human, and that's what made it so horrifying. A single, dark, swirling tattoo or birthmark was visible on the back of the palm, a pattern of interconnected spirals that seemed to move and writhe in the faint light. My heart felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. The hand stayed there for a long time, perfectly still, just hovering. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. I just watched it, waiting for it to do something, waiting for it to turn and press itself against the glass, to show me the rest of whatever impossible thing it was attached to. But it didn't. Instead, after what felt like an eternity, the hand began to close into a fist, slowly and deliberately. The fingers curled in, one by one, until it was a tight, white-knuckled ball. And then, with a sharp, sickening thwack, the fist slammed against the glass. The sound was loud and violent, but it wasn't the sound of breaking glass. It was the sound of something solid hitting something solid. The fist didn't recoil. It stayed pressed against the window, the knuckles white against the dark pane. And for a fleeting moment, I saw a wisp of vapor, like a tiny plume of smoke, escaping from between the knuckles. The air in the room grew even colder, the smell of ozone now thick and metallic. The fear was so intense it was almost a physical weight on my chest, pressing the air from my lungs. I closed my eyes, and a single, desperate thought formed in my mind. I can't do this anymore. I stayed like that, eyes squeezed shut, for a solid minute, maybe more. When I finally dared to open them, the fist was gone. The window was empty again, just the faint reflection of my pale face in the dark glass. The cold was still there, and the ozone smell lingered, but the immediate threat seemed to have vanished. My body was shaking uncontrollably, and tears were streaming down my face. I didn't care anymore. The logical part of me, the part that was trying to rationalize, was dead. It was gone. All that was left was a raw, primal fear. I knew, with absolute certainty, that whatever that thing was, it was not human. I scrambled out of my chair, grabbed my keys, and without even bothering to grab a jacket, I bolted out of my room. I ran down the 5 flights of stairs, my feet pounding on the concrete, not caring about the noise. I ran out of the building and kept running, right out into the middle of the empty quad that I stood there, in the middle of the grass, shivering, looking up at the 5th floor at my window. It was just a dark rectangle among all the other dark rectangles of the other rooms. It looked so normal, so innocent, and for a moment, I considered just going back, pretending it never happened, telling myself I was crazy. But I knew I couldn't, not after what I had seen and felt. I had to get away. I pulled out my phone, my hands still shaking, and called my parents. I just told them I was sick, that I needed to come home, that I couldn't stay at school. They asked questions, but I just kept repeating, I have to come home. I have to. They finally agreed to come get me in the morning, and I went to a friend's dorm room, a girl named Sarah, who had a room on the 2nd floor. I knocked on her door, and when she opened it, I just collapsed into her arms, sobbing. I told her I was sick, but she could see the raw terror in my eyes. She didn't ask questions. She just let me in. I stayed on her couch that night, curled up under a blanket, unable to sleep, but at least feeling a small sliver of safety. The next morning, my dad drove 3 hours to pick me up. He didn't ask much, just looked at my face and seemed to understand something was deeply wrong. We packed up my stuff from the dorm, and when I went back to my room, I couldn't even look at the window. I just stuffed my belongings into boxes as fast as I could, my back to the glass. As we were leaving, I saw the RA, a senior named Mark, in the hallway. He stopped me and said, "Hey, I heard something strange last night from my room. Did you hear it?" I just shook my head, my throat too tight to speak. He shrugged and said, "Weird. It sounded like something hitting the side of the building, up on the 5th floor. But there's no way to get up there. Probably just the old building settling." I didn't say a word. I just got in my dad's car, and we drove away. I never went back to State University. I transferred to a different school the next semester, a place where I could live at home and commute. I never told anyone the full story, not even my parents. How could I? There's no way to explain it. I still get a cold knot in my stomach whenever I see a 5-story building with no fire escape, and the sound of something tapping on glass sends a jolt of pure dread through me. The memory of that swirling mark on the hand, the impossible fist, and the overwhelming feeling of being watched, it's all burned into my brain. I don't know what it was or why it chose my window, but I do know one thing. Some things in this world just don't follow the rules, and sometimes you're just unlucky enough to get a glimpse behind the curtain. And even all these years later, on a rainy night, I still check my windows, just to be sure.